Picture this. A spoiled 20-something in a $3,000 suit, stretching his feet onto a cafe table while a waitress is trying to clean it. He doesn't even look at her. No please, no thank you. He treats her like she's invisible. But here's what he doesn't know. In the back corner, sitting behind round sunglasses, someone's been watching everything. And in about 16 minutes, that young man is going to learn a lesson about respect he'll never forget. Because the person watching him isn't just any customer, it's Ozzy Osbourne. And today, the Prince of Darkness is about to teach a spoiled rich kid what real power looks like. The young man who glided through the cafe's main entrance walked as if he were stepping onto a red carpet. He was maybe 23, 24 years old, but his attitude suggested he'd personally created the small mountains outside. He wore at least a $3,000 Gucci suit, a gleaming Rolex on his wrist, and Italian leather shoes so polished they nearly reflected the sunlight. His name was Brandon, and his father owned the city's largest real estate empire. From the moment Brandon stepped into the cafe, he looked around with such an air that you'd think this was his private club, and the other customers were merely extras in his personal movie. Ozzy watched this scene silently from behind his glasses. Maybe he'd been arrogant in his youth too, but life had taught him some lessons over time. Now he wondered, how much pain would this young man need to go through to learn those same lessons? Brandon headed straight for one of the best tables by the window and sat down as if claiming a throne. Moments later, a young waitress in her 20s, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, approached his table. The girl smiled, tired but kind, and said, "Welcome, sir. How can I help you?" Her voice was so genuine that even Ozzy thought he could never have been that polite in his youth. But Brandon didn't look at her. He just kept staring at his phone. A long silence followed. The waitress waited, her smile slowly fading. Finally, Brandon, without lifting his head from his phone, said, "Espresso. Make it quick. I'm in a hurry." No please, no thank you, not even eye contact. Just an order, as if the person in front of him wasn't human, but a robot. The waitress bowed her head slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll bring it right away," she said, and walked toward the kitchen. Ozzy set his cup down on the table and didn't take his eyes off Brandon. A voice inside him said, "Ah, kid, you still don't know what kind of surprises life has in store for you." But he didn't say anything yet. He just watched. A few minutes later, the waitress returned with a steaming espresso on her tray. As she approached the table, Brandon suddenly stretched his feet onto the table. The soles of his shoes dirtied the spots the waitress had just cleaned. She paused for a moment. A brief flash of surprise crossed her eyes, but she said nothing. She simply placed the espresso in front of Brandon and said, "Enjoy." Brandon, without lifting his head from his phone, made a sound. As the waitress walked away from the table, Ozzy saw her face. There was exhaustion there, maybe a bit of hurt too. But she didn't complain. She didn't make a sound. She just continued with her work. Ozzy thought to himself, this girl is strong. But what Brandon had done reminded him of something. Years ago, he'd encountered people like this too. Backstage, in hotels, in restaurants. Money and fame brought out the worst in some people. And now, this young man was walking down that same road. Ozzy took another sip of his coffee and kept waiting. Because he knew that sometimes life sends someone to teach you a lesson. And today, that someone might just be him. Brandon began looking around as he sipped his espresso. His eyes wandered over the people in the cafe. At the table next to him sat an elderly couple. Brandon shot them the same dismissive look. Ozzy watched this scene and thought to himself, "Kid, you really don't know how small you are in this big world?" But still, he remained silent. Because the time to intervene hadn't come yet. First, Brandon needed to dig himself a little deeper. A few minutes later, the waitress approached the table again. This time she had a cloth in her hand and was wiping down tables. When she reached Brandon's table, she asked politely, "Excuse me, sir, may I clean your table?" Brandon looked at the girl, then at his feet, then back at the girl. And then, instead of slowly lowering his feet from the table, he stretched them out even further. "Clean around them," Brandon said. as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I'm in a hurry. I don't have time to move my feet." The waitress froze for a moment. She opened her mouth, as if about to say something, but then gave up. She bowed her head and said, "Okay, sir." Then she began trying to wipe the table around Brandon's feet. The scene was so absurd that a few people in the cafe noticed and exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. Everyone minded their own business, until the old man in the back corner slowly rose from his seat. Ozzy Osbourne. His hands were trembling slightly, but this time not from Parkinson's. It was something else, perhaps a bit of sadness, because standing before him was a young man who, once upon a time, he himself might have been. And now it was time to teach him something. Ozzy walked slowly toward Brandon's table. A few people in the cafe recognized him, and whispers began. "Isn't that Ozzy Osbourne? Yes, I'm sure it's him." But Ozzy paid no attention to any of them. His eyes were only on Brandon. Brandon noticed the old man approaching but didn't seem particularly interested. When Ozzy reached the table, he stopped and looked at Brandon. A long silence followed. Then Ozzy, in that characteristic English accent of his but with a gentle voice, said, "Excuse me, son, but I think we've got a problem here." Brandon furrowed his brow and looked Ozzy up and down. "A problem? Who are you?" he asked. Ozzy smiled faintly. That smile carried the pain and wisdom of years. "Who am I?" Ozzy said. "I'm just someone trying to enjoy a coffee in this cafe, same as you. But here's the difference, mate. I don't put my feet up on the table in front of waitresses." Surprise flashed across Brandon's face first, then irritation. He still hadn't quite figured out who this old man approaching his table was, but it was clear he didn't like his tone. "Look, old man," Brandon said, raising his voice. "Who are you to tell me what to do? This is my table. I'll do what I want." Ozzy tilted his head slightly and looked at Brandon in a way that seemed to read right through him. He'd stood before thousands of people on stages for years, weathered every kind of storm life could throw at him. Breaking this young man's arrogance didn't require shouting or threats. The truth was enough. "I know the table's yours, son," Ozzy said calmly. "But showing respect to this cafe, showing respect to the people who work here, that's your responsibility too. That young girl." He gestured toward the waitress. "She's not here to dance around your feet. She's trying to earn an honest living." The other customers in the cafe were now silently watching the scene unfold. The waitress stood a few meters away, clutching her cloth, unsure what to do. In her eyes was both surprise and gratitude. Brandon looked around and became uncomfortable when he realized people were watching him. "This doesn't concern you," Brandon said, but this time his voice carried less confidence. "Mind your own business." Ozzy smiled faintly and slipped his hands into his pockets. His hands trembled occasionally from Parkinson's, but his posture was so calm and steady that all of Brandon's arrogance seemed to shrink in his presence. "I'd love to mind my own business, son," Ozzy said. "But you know, I was once like you. Young, famous, had money. And I thought I'd conquered the world." Brandon's eyes narrowed. "Famous? You?" he asked with a mocking tone. Ozzy responded to the question with a smile. "Yeah, son. My name's Ozzy Osbourne. Maybe you haven't heard of me, but I used to have a little band called Black Sabbath." The whispers in the cafe grew louder. A few people pulled out their phones and started recording. Brandon's face suddenly changed. Ozzy Osbourne. Yes, he'd heard that name. His father used to listen to his records. He was one of rock music's legends. And now, this legend was standing in front of him, calling him out. Brandon wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Ozzy continued, "You know, son, I made a lot of mistakes when I was young too. I treated people badly. Thought I was big and made others feel small, but life taught me a few things. And the biggest lesson was this. No matter how much money, fame, or power someone has, no person is better than another. We all came from the same earth, and we'll all return to the same earth." His words were so simple, so sincere, that a silence fell over the cafe. Only the distant sound of cars and birds chirping could be heard. Brandon sat at his table, frozen. His feet were still on the table, but that confident attitude was gone. Ozzy took another step closer and lowered his voice a bit more. Now I'm going to tell you something, son, and I want you to listen carefully. Those expensive shoes of yours, that Rolex, your daddy's money, none of that makes you important. What makes you important is how you treat other people. That waitress right there. He turned and looked at the waitress. She might not have as much money as you. She might not be famous. But while she's trying to serve you kindly, you're disrespecting her. Does that make you big? Brandon's eyes dropped to the floor. Maybe the first time in his life someone was talking to him like this. And worst of all, that person was right. Ozzy took a deep breath and continued. Let me tell you a story, son. Years ago, after a concert, we were heading back to the hotel in a limousine, and we had a driver, an old man. I hadn't even asked his name. That night, thousands of people at the concert had applauded me, screamed, cheered. I felt like the king of the world. When I got in the limo, I was really rude to the driver. Drive fast, I said. Don't keep me waiting. The man didn't say anything. He just nodded and drove. But that night, when we got to the hotel, that man turned to me and said something. Mr. Osbourne, he said, I'm just a driver to you. But I'm also a human being. I've got a family, hopes, dreams, and I deserve a bit of respect. I never forgot that moment. Ozzy locked eyes with Brandon. That man taught me a lesson that night, and I've carried that lesson with me my whole life. Now I'm trying to give you that same lesson. Brandon couldn't say anything anymore. He could feel the people around him watching, but this time he didn't feel pride. He felt shame. Slowly, he lowered his feet from the table and placed them on the floor. Ozzy saw this movement and nodded slightly. There you go, Ozzy said. Small gesture, but it's a start. Then he turned to the waitress. Sweetheart, Ozzy said in a gentle voice. What's your name? The waitress looked surprised. Sarah, she said. Sarah Rodriguez. Ozzy smiled. Sarah, you've been very patient and kind here today. This young man treated you unfairly, but you still did your job. That's a powerful thing. You're a true professional. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Perhaps for the first time in her life, someone was saying something like this to her. Thank you, Sarah said, her voice trembling. Thank you so much. Ozzy turned to Brandon. Now, son, it's your turn. You owe this young woman an apology. Brandon lifted his head and looked at Sarah. There was a war going on inside him. His ego was telling him that apologizing was weakness, but his heart knew Ozzy was right. After a long silence, Brandon slowly stood up. Sarah, Brandon said, his voice hoarse and sincere. I treated you really badly. I'm sorry, truly. You're here working, trying to make a living, and I acted like a complete idiot. Sarah looked at him in surprise. She hadn't expected this apology. Thank you, Sarah said. I accept your apology. Brandon sat back down and put his head in his hands. Ozzy wanted to say something more to him, but decided against it. Sometimes silence is the strongest teacher. Instead, he turned to Sarah. Could you bring me an espresso too, love? Ozzy said. And one for this young man as well. On me. Sarah smiled. Of course. Right away. Ozzy returned to his own table and sat down. His hands were still trembling, but inside he felt at peace. Maybe today he'd made a small difference in a young man's life. Maybe Brandon would remember this day and treat others better in the future. A few minutes later, Sarah returned with 2 espressos. She placed one on Ozzy's table and the other on Brandon's. Brandon looked at Sarah and said, Thank you, Sarah. Really. Sarah nodded and walked away. Ozzy sipped his espresso while watching Brandon. The young man picked up his cup and slowly drank. Then he looked toward Ozzy. Their eyes met. Brandon nodded slightly in acknowledgement, and Ozzy did the same. No words were needed. In that moment, everything was understood. The sun had begun to set slowly, and a golden light washed over the Ivy Cafe's terrace. The people in the cafe gradually returned to their own worlds, but everyone who was there that day had witnessed something. A small but important moment, A moment showing how a legend could make a difference, not just with his music, but with his humanity. Ozzy finished his coffee, slowly stood up, and pulled out his wallet. As he walked toward the register to pay his bill, he passed Sarah and said, "You're an amazing person, Sarah. Don't ever forget that." Sarah, her eyes shining, said, "So are you, Mr. Osbourne. So are you." Ozzy smiled and walked outside. That warm Los Angeles afternoon now felt a little more meaningful. Brandon sat at his table, lost in deep thought. His cup was empty, but he still held it. Maybe for the first time he was truly thinking about who he was, about how he'd been acting, and about what kind of person he wanted to be. That day at the Ivy, he'd only come in for a coffee, but at the same time, he'd received one of the most important lessons of his life. And that lesson had come from a rock legend. Sometimes the greatest teachers come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the lessons learned over a cup of coffee can change a life. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that true greatness comes from humility, please take a moment to subscribe to the Prince of Darkness Stories. Tell us in the comments, do you think Brandon really changed after that day? Or what would you have done if you were in Ozzy's place? Because sometimes one moment of courage can make the world a little better.